it was always going to be hard after the car you had earlier to turn it around completely. Did anything improve once you changed this?
The car felt a lot better. It just didn't reflect that in times.
Sorry, say the last bit again.
It just didn't reflect that in the times.
And is that your feeling in the car? Is it we were listening to the throttle?
The car felt good. Honestly, the car felt a lot better than it was in the rest of the weekend. We were looking okay, and then we just didn't get the last lap.
Was that not enough fuel to double cool? Did you want to?
That I don't know.
Okay.
What if I told you that Lewis Hamilton's car has been defective for months, and that Ferrari knew about it and hid it? Who covered it up? And why is it discovered just now at the Qatar GP? Get ready, because what you are going to see could be the most serious technical scandal in the entire modern era of Formula One. It was in Qatar where everything exploded. A circuit with aggressive curbs, extreme temperatures, and extremely high technical demands on the chassis and suspension. A perfect setting for hidden defects to come to light. There, after the qualifying session, the numbers began to speak louder than ever. Telemetry from Hamilton's car revealed unusual rear axle oscillations, sudden changes in ride height, inconsistent downforce peaks, and general instability that simply didn't match the team's simulations. Vasseur, the Ferrari team manager, was quick to react. What began as a simple routine check became an internal investigation that would end up uncovering one of the best-kept technical secrets of the year. What he found was a structural design flaw in the SF25's rear suspension. But even more serious was discovering that some engineers in the technical department already knew about the problem and decided to hide it. They did not inform Vasseur. They did not inform the pilot. And they kept going with configuration patches, improvised adjustments, and silence. All for fear of facing the consequences of redesigning a chassis mid-season in the midst of the budget limit era. This revelation not only revealed a technical crisis, but also a crisis of leadership, internal trust, and values within a team that has been trying to return to the top for decades. In a matter of hours, what seemed like a simple performance anomaly became a structural earthquake for the most emblematic team in world motorsport. And Hamilton? He was the last to find out. When they told him the truth, there were no screams or explosions, just a silent stare, because he understood everything. He realized that for months he had been racing with a car that had been sabotaged from the inside. Not because of bad intentions, but because of cowardly decisions, by omissions, out of fear. And in Formula One, fear always takes its toll. This is the story of how Ferrari hid a flaw that could have cost one of the greatest drivers in history a championship. A story that begins with an uncomfortable question. How is it possible that no one said anything? What Fred Vasseur discovered was not simply a failure. It was a technical betrayal hidden under layers of structural complexity, internal pressures, and compromised decisions. At the heart of Hamilton's SF25, the problem was right where no Formula One team can afford weakness, in the rear suspension. A fundamental piece that connects the behavior of the car with the driver's confidence, which determines how the car responds to the dynamic stress of cornering, lateral load changes, aggressive curbs, and extreme temperature peaks. And that part was defective. More specifically, the failure lay in the rear suspension mounting points. Under certain racing conditions, particularly those where the heat of the asphalt exceeded 45 degrees or where the car suffered prolonged G-forces in high-speed corners, the structure gave way millimeters. Not enough to cause a breakage or a technical penalty, but just enough to completely alter the dynamic geometry of the car. In other words, Hamilton's SF25 was not the same car corner to corner. It varied its ride height unpredictably. It lost consistency in traction. It changed its balance when braking. And as a direct consequence, it degraded its rear tires prematurely. And the most serious thing is not the failure itself. The devastating thing was discovering that the technical team already knew him. For months, they had identified strange behavior in winter simulation tests, but they ruled out a complete reconstruction of the affected area. The reason? Redesigning the chassis at that point in the season would involve homologating a new structure, carrying out new crash tests required by the FIA, and declaring expenses that would push Ferrari over the budget limit. A risk that, according to them, they could not afford to take. During the qualifying session, the differences between his performance and that of Charles Leclerc became unsustainable. Not only in lap time, but in data. Telemetry showed extreme variations in the ride height of Hamilton's rear axle, especially in fast corners like 9 and 13. This set off alarm bells. The technical team, forced by the pressure of real-time analysis, had to show the data to Vasseur. That's when the storm started. Vasseur, distrustful, compared the telemetry between both cars. What he saw was shocking. Leclerc's car showed a much more stable line of behavior, without those oscillations in the rear load or such extreme temperature peaks in the tires. But most telling was an anomaly detected by the predictive analysis software that Ferrari had developed that season. The system identified a pattern that had been repeated since several Grand Prix. The lateral and vertical load peaks on Hamilton's car fell below the optimal threshold during long stints, a clear indication of structural deformation. The next day, in a more detailed physical examination with mechanical stress sensors, the suspicion was confirmed. The rear suspension mounting on Hamilton's SF25 was not adequately supporting the stress accumulated in conditions such as those at Lusail. It was not a failure visible to the naked eye, it was not an obvious break, but it was a deviation that completely altered the dynamics of the car when fully loaded. And worst of all, internal records showed that this anomaly had already been detected weeks before. Vasseur, seeing the previous technical reports, realized that it was not a new problem. It was a buried problem, silenced by engineers who had chosen to adjust compensation parameters without addressing the root cause. This was not a spontaneous failure. It was the result of administrative decisions. Fear of sanctions for exceeding the spending limit. A deliberate strategy to buy time, at the expense of a champion's performance. What he discovered in Qatar was not just a mechanical defect. It was an act of cover-up within one of the most prestigious structures in motorsport. And that, for a leader like Vasseur, was unacceptable. At that moment, he understood that Ferrari's real problem was not the car. They were his own people. When Fred Vasseur discovered the truth behind the technical analysis in Qatar, there was no room for diplomacy. What was revealed was not simply an engineering error. It was a breach in the chain of trust, a symptom of a culture that preferred to cover up problems rather than confront them at their roots. And that, for someone like Vasseur, was unacceptable. The technical team was called that same night. The doors of the hospitality were closed. There were no cameras. There were no communications. Just one directive: explanations. And what emerged in that room was even more serious than he expected. Mid-level engineers admitted that the rear suspension anomaly had been detected in Silverstone simulations, but it was decided to shelve it. It was argued that the structural redesign necessary to correct it would involve redoing parts of the chassis, and that would drive costs beyond the limit imposed by the FIA. Instead, configuration settings were chosen to mitigate the problem. A decision made in the shadows, without escalation to the central technical direction or Vasseur himself. This revelation caused an immediate fracture. Several key engineers were suspended internally, and a full audit was initiated into quality control and technical oversight procedures within the team. Vasseur knew that the problem was no longer technical. It was structural. Ferrari had inherited a way of operating where internal fears, the weight of history and media pressure distorted decision-making. But the consequences went beyond the technical staff. The relationship between Hamilton and the team, until then built on a narrative of mutual illusion, began to crack. Lewis, although publicly he remained calm, showed his confusion in internal meetings. For weeks he had questioned the car's behavior and had received vague, even patronizing answers. Now I knew why. His trust had not only been tested on the track, it had been betrayed. Charles Leclerc, for his part, was also called to testify internally, since his car, although free of the defect, shared certain experimental configurations that had been developed in parallel. This opened an uncomfortable debate within the team. Were there differences in technical treatment between the two drivers? Was Leclerc at any point prioritized over Hamilton when implementing solutions? In the press, Ferrari tried to keep the narrative under control. Ambiguous statements were leaked, attention was diverted to future improvements, and it was suggested that Qatar's data had been exaggerated. But in the paddock everyone knew the truth. There was an internal crisis in Maranello. The FIA did not take long to become interested. Although this was not a direct violation of the regulations, deliberately concealing a structural defect that affected a driver's performance could be interpreted as an ethical omission. And although there were no sanctions, a special line of communication was opened between the technical stewards and Ferrari to monitor future modifications to the SF25. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.